History was not built by kings alone. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room was the woman wearing the crown, stealing it, or burning the kingdom down before breakfast. Here are 32 queens and empresses who crushed enemies, outplayed empires, and made powerful men look hilariously unprepared. Some were brilliant, some were ruthless. A few were basically both on steroids. 1. Zetian was not some honorary palace figure or temporary stand-in. She became the actual Emperor of China, the only woman in Chinese history to officially claim that title in her own name. And the road there was pure imperial nightmare fuel. She entered court as a teenage concubine, which usually meant your future depended on whether the emperor noticed you before forgetting you existed. When that emperor died, she was supposed to disappear into a Buddhist convent and stay there. Instead, she somehow returned to court and caught the attention of his successor. That alone was wild. Then came the rumors that she murdered her own infant daughter and blamed the empress. Maybe propaganda, maybe not. But the terrifying part is that people found it believable. She built a secret police machine, rewarded informers, crushed enemies, and by 67 took the throne herself. Even crazier, once she got it, she ruled effectively. 2. Margaret of Anjou basically became the engine of the Lancastrian cause because her husband, Henry VI, kept mentally checking out of reality. Not metaphorically. The man could fall into months-long states of total unresponsiveness, leaving England in the hands of panic, ambition, and bad decisions, which, to be fair, was already a national hobby. So Margaret stepped in and did what half the men around her were failing to do. She rallied supporters, negotiated abroad, pushed nobles into action, planned strategy, and kept the dynasty alive by sheer force of will. When the Yorkists started steamrolling everything, she fled, regrouped in Scotland and France, and kept fighting instead of accepting defeat like some polite medieval loser. She even secured French backing and returned with an army. Her side was eventually crushed at Tewkesbury, her son was killed, and she ended her life in poverty, but nobody can accuse her of going down quietly. 3. Jadwiga of Poland was crowned king, not queen, because medieval politics loved technical absurdity. In Poland, the ruler's title was masculine, so when this child monarch took the throne in 1384, at around 10 to 12 years old, they basically said, "Congratulations, tiny king." But Jadwiga was not just ceremonial furniture in a crown. She was intelligent, politically sharp, and far more involved in real power than her age might suggest. Her biggest move was agreeing to marry Jogaila of Lithuania, which created the Polish-Lithuanian Union, one of the most important political partnerships in European history. That decision reshaped Central and Eastern Europe for centuries. She also helped restore Krakow University, later known as Jagiellonian University, which became one of the continent's major intellectual centers. She died young, likely after childbirth, at just 25. Brutally short life, massive historical impact. Some rulers get decades and do nothing. Jadwiga got a few years and changed the map. 4. Cleopatra got flattened by pop culture into some glamorous seductress with eyeliner, milk baths, and a convenient snake. The real Cleopatra was far more dangerous and far more impressive. She was highly educated, politically ruthless, and reportedly spoke multiple languages, including Egyptian, which was already more effort than many rulers in her dynasty had bothered to make. She was not just flirting her way through history. She was maneuvering through the collapsing Roman Republic like a player at a table full of armed psychopaths. She aligned with Julius Caesar, had a son with him, then partnered with Mark Antony, and had 3 more children, all while trying to keep Egypt independent and maybe even expand its influence. She personally directed fleets and took part in high-level military decisions during the war against Octavian. She lost, yes, but not because she was trivial. She lost because Rome produced a colder monster. Her death ended her dynasty and ancient Egypt's long line of pharaohs. 5. Ching Shih began in a floating brothel and ended as the kind of pirate boss actual governments could not get rid of, which is one of the greatest career upgrades in history. When the pirate commander Zheng Yi wanted to marry her, She did not just say yes and smile politely. She negotiated an equal share in his power because apparently she understood mergers and acquisitions better than most modern executives. After his death, she seized full control and turned a pirate alliance into a disciplined floating empire. At her height, she commanded tens of thousands of pirates and hundreds of ships, enough to make some official navies look embarrassingly underfunded. She fought the Qing Navy, the Portuguese, and basically anyone else who thought they could stop her. Her genius was structure. She imposed strict laws, punished theft from friendly villages with death, and treated desertion like a personal insult. Then, when China could not beat her, she negotiated amnesty, kept her wealth, retired rich, and died peacefully. Absolute pirate masterclass. 6. Lady Trieu, also known as Trieu Thi Trinh, led a rebellion against Chinese rule in 3rd century Vietnam, and her attitude was so gloriously uncooperative it still sounds cinematic. When her brothers suggested she calm down, get married, and live quietly like a proper woman, she basically rejected the entire concept with legendary style. She said she wanted to ride the strong winds, crush the fierce waves, kill the sharks or whales of the Eastern Sea, and drive out foreign invaders rather than bow her head and serve any man. That is not a statement. That is a thunderstorm. Tradition says she rode into battle on a war elephant, dressed in golden armor, commanding her forces like she had been born specifically to terrify occupiers. The uprising failed against the Wu kingdom's military strength, and she chose death over capture while still very young. Even in defeat, she became immortal in Vietnamese memory. You do not forget someone who talks like that and actually means it. 7. Olga of Kiev begins her story with widowhood and then immediately sprints into one of the most unhinged revenge campaigns in medieval history. After the Drevlians murdered her husband Igor in 945, they made the astonishingly stupid decision to send ambassadors proposing she marry their prince. Olga welcomed them politely because apparently she enjoyed setting traps with excellent manners. Then she had the first delegation thrown into a pit and buried alive. A second group arrived later and received a warm invitation to bathe before the meeting. She locked them inside the bathhouse and burned it down. Still not enough. She hosted a funeral feast, got large numbers of Drevlians drunk, and had thousands slaughtered. Then came the bizarre masterpiece. She demanded tribute in the form of birds, attached burning material to them, and released them. The birds flew home, setting the whole city on fire. And somehow, after all that, Olga was later canonized as a saint. Medieval history was not normal. 8. Tomyris, queen of the Massagetae, gave Cyrus the Great the kind of ending legendary conquerors are not supposed to get. Cyrus had already crushed major kingdoms and probably assumed this nomadic people in Central Asia would be just another item on the empire shopping list. Bad assumption. First, he used trickery, leaving behind a camp stocked with wine that Tomyris' forces were not used to drinking. Some of her warriors got drunk, many were killed, and her son was captured. He later took his own life in captivity, which turned the conflict from war into something much more personal. Tomyris sent Cyrus a message promising him more blood than he could ever want, and then followed through. In the battle that came next, Cyrus was killed. According to Herodotus, Tomyris had his head cut off and plunged into a container filled with human blood, telling him to drink his fill. That is not just victory. That is historical mic drop with trauma and vengeance attached. 9. Fredegund started life as a servant and climbed all the way up to feared Merovingian queen by treating murder like a political management tool. She caught King Chilperic's attention, and then, somehow, everyone standing between her and power began having an absolutely terrible time. One royal wife was strangled. Another, Galsvintha, ended up murdered in bed not long after Fredegund became the king's mistress, and nobody at the time was exactly buying the Innocence Act. Once Fredegund became queen, the bloodshed kept going. Rivals, clerics, political threats, inconvenient relatives, even stepsons with claims that interfered with her children's future all seemed to attract lethal bad luck. She fought a vicious feud with Brunhilde that dragged on for years and left a trail of chaos across the Frankish kingdoms. Even when Chilperic was murdered, suspicion drifted toward her. She outlived him, protected her son's position, and died peacefully, which honestly feels rude considering how many people did not get that option. 10. Nur Jahan was supposed to be an empress consort, but in practice she operated more like the real executive branch of the Mughal Empire, while her husband Jahangir was busy enjoying wine, opium, and the general vibe of not being terribly useful. She was not subtle about her influence either. Orders were issued in her name, coins were struck naming her, and she held the title Padshah Begum, which was basically as close as you could get to female emperor, without the men at court fainting. She was politically active, deeply involved in administration, a patron of architecture and the arts, and fully capable of handling danger herself. During one royal hunt, she reportedly killed 4 tigers with 6 shots from atop an elephant, which is a sentence that sounds fake until you remember Mughal history enjoyed showing off. When a coup threatened Jahangir, Nur Jahan organized resistance. Her power faded after his death, but for years she was running one of the richest empires on earth. 11. Kosem Sultan rose from enslaved Greek girl to the single most powerful woman in Ottoman history, which already tells you this story is not heading anywhere gentle. She entered the imperial harem, became Sultan Ahmed I's favorite, bore several sons, and built influence the smart way by making herself impossible to ignore in both palace and state matters. After Ahmed died, Kosem did not fade into the wallpaper like some retired court ornament. She became the power behind multiple thrones, first through her sons and then through her grandsons. For decades, major decisions in the empire passed through her hands. She was effectively a long-term co-ruler inside one of the most complex courts in the world. But Ottoman palace politics loved ending in silk cords and bad nights. In 1651, her feud with Turhan Sultan reached the point of no return. Accused of plotting to replace her grandson, Kosem was attacked in her chambers, dragged out, and strangled. Even in her 60s, sources say she fought back hard. 12. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt by recognizing one brutal fact about power in her world. The role of pharaoh was coded male, so if she wanted the full authority, she had to wear the whole package. And she did. She took male royal titles, appeared in official art with a masculine body, and even used the ceremonial false beard, not because she was confused, but because she understood branding before branding existed. She was not playing dress-up. She was making a constitutional argument in stone. More importantly, it worked. Her reign lasted over 20 years and was marked by stability, major building projects, successful trade expeditions, and general prosperity. She was one of Egypt's most competent rulers, full stop. After her death, her stepson Thutmose III later tried to erase her from monuments and memory, likely for political reasons rather than instant personal revenge. Either way, it did not work. Hatshepsut survived the chisels. History remembers her far more vividly than many kings who supposedly fit the role better. 13. Catherine the Great arrived in Russia as a minor German princess with the kind of prospects history usually assigns to decorative marriage pieces. Instead, she learned Russian, converted to Orthodoxy, studied the court around her, and eventually outplayed nearly everyone in it. Her husband, Peter III, was widely seen as erratic, immature, and bizarrely fond of Prussia, which was not exactly a winning trait when ruling Russia. Catherine watched this disaster unfold and clearly decided she was not going down with him. In 1762, she backed a coup with the support of the Imperial Guard. Peter abdicated and then conveniently died a few days later under suspicious circumstances. Medieval and early modern politics really loved the phrase, "mysteriously died," did they not? Catherine then ruled for 34 years, expanded the empire, modernized administration, supported arts and education, and corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers. Her enemies spread endless gossip about her private life, because apparently even greatness needs tabloid accessories. The real story was already dramatic enough. 14. Lady Six Sky arrived in Naranjo, when the city was battered, weakened, and politically humiliated, then proceeded to rebuild it into a serious Maya power, as if decline were just an annoying scheduling issue. She likely came from a stronger dynasty as part of a strategic alliance, but once in place she did far more than produce ceremonial legitimacy. She performed rituals usually reserved for male rulers, directed or inspired military campaigns, and recentered the kingdom around her authority. Maya monuments from her reign do not portray her as some passive royal mother, standing politely to the side. They show her looming over bound captives and participating in elite rituals that screamed power, conquest, and restored prestige. One monument in particular makes the message almost rude in its clarity. Naranjo was not the victim anymore. Her son technically held the throne, but the inscriptions keep highlighting her dominance because everyone knew who was really driving the comeback. She did not just preserve a kingdom, she rebooted one. 15. Queen Nanny of the Maroons became one of the most feared enemies the British ever faced in Jamaica, which is remarkable considering she was leading communities of escaped slaves from the mountains rather than sitting on some glittering European throne. The Maroons had built independent settlements in brutal terrain, and Nanny turned that landscape into a military nightmare for colonial troops. She mastered guerrilla warfare, ambush tactics, and the art of making a superior imperial force look deeply confused and very dead. British soldiers sent into the interior often did not return, and officials started describing her with an almost supernatural awe because they could not quite process how badly she kept outmaneuvering them. That says less about magic and more about colonial arrogance meeting competence. After years of failing to crush the Maroons, the British signed treaties in 1740 recognizing their autonomy. Nanny became a national hero, appears on Jamaican currency, and remains the only woman among Jamaica's national heroes. She forced empire to negotiate. 16. Boudica became Rome's worst local problem in Britain after the empire made the catastrophic mistake of turning cruelty into policy and expecting obedience in return. When her husband died, Roman officials ignored his arrangements, seized Iceni property, had Boudica publicly whipped, and assaulted her daughters. At that point, Rome basically poured oil on a fire and then acted surprised by flames. Boudica rallied a massive force of Britons and launched a ferocious revolt that tore through Roman settlements. Camulodunum was destroyed. Londinium was burned. Verulamium too. Archaeology still preserves the destruction in a layer of scorched debris, which is a very solid way to leave a review. Ancient writers claimed tens of thousands died, and even if their numbers were inflated, the devastation was real enough to terrify Rome. Eventually, the legions regrouped and crushed the uprising, but Boudica refused capture and chose death instead. Now her statue stands in London, almost mockingly close to the city Rome could not protect from her. 17. Caterina Sforza handled threats with the subtlety of a cannon shot. When enemies seized her children and tried to force her surrender by holding them hostage outside her fortress, they clearly expected tears, panic, and quick compliance. What they got instead was one of history's most outrageous acts of defiance. Caterina climbed the walls, exposed herself in the direction of the attackers, and shouted that they could kill the children if they wanted because she still had the means to make more. That was not diplomacy. That was psychological warfare conducted at full volume. The kidnappers were so stunned they barely knew what to do with the situation. Her children survived, which makes the story somehow even better. Later, when Cesare Borgia came after her, she did not fold then either. She defended her stronghold, fought alongside her forces, and after capture still tried plotting against him with poisoned letters. Caterina approached surrender the way a wolf approaches vegetarianism. 18. Amanirenas, the one-eyed queen of Kush, looked at Rome after its conquest of Egypt and decided the southern frontier was not going to stay comfortable for very long. While the Romans were busy assuming their border was secure, she launched attacks into Roman territory, seized forts, and carried off statues of Augustus as trophies, which is already a pretty bold way to send feedback to an empire. Rome responded, of course, because empires do not enjoy being embarrassed by African warrior queens. But Amanirenas was not some symbolic figure watching from behind the lines. She fought through years of conflict, reportedly losing an eye in battle and continuing anyway, which is the kind of detail that makes lesser rulers quietly sit down. Eventually, Rome concluded the war was more trouble than it was worth and made peace on favorable terms, leaving Kush independent. Best detail of all, a bronze head of Augustus was buried beneath temple steps so people could literally walk over the emperor's face. That is elite long-term trolling. 19. Irene of Athens became the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own right, and she paid for that achievement with one of the darkest acts any ruler has committed against family. She started as regent for her son Constantine VI. But once you get used to running an empire, apparently sharing becomes less appealing. As Constantine got older and tried to exercise real authority, the struggle between them turned into a full political war dressed in imperial silk. In 797, Irene made her move. Constantine was seized and blinded in the very chamber where he had been born, a grotesque irony the Byzantines probably found poetic. The blinding was so severe he likely died soon after, though official history became suspiciously vague. Irene then ruled alone, even using the title Basileus, emperor, rather than the feminine version. She was later overthrown and exiled, dying far from power, but she had already forced herself into history in a way nobody could politely ignore. 20. Empress Maud, or Matilda, never got the English crown she fought for, but she did produce one of the coldest escape stories in medieval history. During the civil war known as the Anarchy, she was trapped inside Oxford Castle in the winter of 1142, while King Stephen's forces surrounded it. Supplies were running low, the siege was tightening, and surrender was starting to look like the obvious ending. Maud disagreed. One snowy December night, she and a few loyal knights slipped out wearing white, blending into the frozen landscape like a medieval stealth mission somehow approved by fate itself. They crossed the icy river and moved through enemy lines without being seen, then marched for miles in brutal conditions until they reached safety. She never became queen in her own right, but she did something many rulers fail at. She stayed in the game long enough to win through the next generation. Her son became Henry II. Sometimes history rewards endurance more than coronation. 21. Matilda of Tuscany was so powerful that a Holy Roman Emperor ended up standing barefoot in winter outside her castle, like a man regretting every decision he had made that year. In 1077, Emperor Henry IV was in serious trouble after being excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII. Excommunication was not just bad press, it was political disaster because his nobles suddenly had spiritual cover to turn on him. To fix that, Henry had to seek forgiveness from the Pope, who happened to be staying at Canossa under the protection of Matilda. So Henry came to beg, and Matilda absolutely did not rush to make things easy. For 3 days, he waited outside in the snow wearing penitent clothing, freezing and humbling himself while the Pope and Matilda held the real leverage behind the walls. Imagine being Holy Roman Emperor and still not getting past the door. Matilda remained a major military and political force long after, commanding troops and defending papal interests like it was just part of the week. 22. Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, is one of those historical figures who should be far more famous but got buried under the usual avalanche of male credit distribution. Daughter of Alfred the Great, she did not simply inherit prestige. She earned military reputation the hard way. When her husband became too ill to govern effectively, she took over Mercia and turned it into an offensive force against the Vikings. Her strategy was not reckless heroics but intelligent, structured warfare. She oversaw the building and strengthening of burhs, fortified towns that served as defensive anchors and launch points for reconquest. Then she used them brilliantly. Derby fell, Leicester followed. Viking control that had once looked deeply entrenched began to crack. By the time she died in 918, she was preparing to take York and may have come closer than almost anyone to unifying England herself. Instead, her brother Edward absorbed the achievement and history let him keep more of the applause. The Vikings, however, knew exactly who was beating them. 23. Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi became one of the fiercest symbols of resistance to British rule in India, because when the British tried to erase her kingdom, she chose war instead of polite compliance. After her husband's death, the East India Company refused to recognize her adopted son as heir and moved to annex Jhansi. Lakshmibai did not accept that like a minor paperwork inconvenience. She joined the uprising of 1857 and quickly became one of its most formidable leaders. She trained forces, inspired loyalty, and rode into battle herself, which is why later legend attached scenes of her charging with her child strapped to her back and weapons in both hands. Some of that is probably embellished, but her courage in combat was real enough that even British officers respected it through clenched teeth. She died young, fighting in battle rather than surrendering, and a British general called her the most dangerous rebel leader. That was meant as condemnation. History heard admiration. 24. Tamar the Great ruled Georgia with such authority that Queen apparently felt too small, so she used the title King of Kings. That was not vanity. It was an accurate summary of how dominant her reign became. From 1184 to 1213, Georgia reached the height of its military strength and cultural brilliance under her leadership. She expanded territory, defeated major rivals including Seljuk forces, and helped project Georgian influence across the region. At the same time, her court became a center of artistic and literary flourishing. This was Georgia's golden age, the period later generations looked back on with that mixture of pride and disbelief reserved for truly exceptional eras. Shota Rustaveli produced his great epic during her reign, likely in her honor, which is one way to guarantee your image survives beautifully. Tamar also managed internal noble politics with real skill, balancing power without letting the kingdom fracture. More than 8 centuries later, she is still treated not as a great female ruler, but as one of Georgia's greatest rulers, period. 25. Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba spent more than 40 years fighting Portuguese expansion in Angola, and she did it with a mix of nerve, flexibility, and theatrical dominance that makes most diplomats look half asleep. During a meeting with the Portuguese governor in 1622, she walked into a room designed to humiliate her. He had a chair. She did not. The message was obvious. "Stand below me." Nzinga refused the script. She ordered one of her attendants to kneel on all fours and sat on the man's back like a living throne, conducting negotiations at equal height. Problem solved. That one scene tells you almost everything about her. She converted to Christianity when it served her, shifted alliances when needed, worked with the Dutch against Portuguese interests, led troops personally, and kept fighting into old age. She was not trapped by rigid ideology or pride. She adapted, survived, and built power in conditions designed to crush African rulers. That is why she still towers over the history of resistance. 26. Idia, mother of Oba Esigi of Benin, did not settle for being remembered as a supportive royal parent standing elegantly in the background while the men handled history. According to tradition, when Benin faced major conflict with the Igala, she played a decisive role through political influence, spiritual protection, and possibly direct military support. She was described as a skilled healer, an expert in medicinal and ritual knowledge, preparing protective substances for warriors and strengthening her son's chances in war. Her importance became so undeniable that Esigi created the title Ioba, Queen Mother, specifically for her, complete with her own palace and recognized authority. That is not sentimental family appreciation. That is institutional acknowledgement of power. Her legacy survived most vividly in art, especially the famous ivory mask associated with her, one of the greatest masterpieces of Benin culture. Centuries later, that image became a symbol of Nigerian identity and African heritage. Idia was not just remembered, she was carved into permanence. 27. Himiko ruled ancient Japan from behind a wall of ritual mystery so thick that even now historians are still squinting through it, trying to figure out what exactly was going on. Chinese records describe her as a shaman queen who emerged after a long period of internal conflict and somehow managed to unite multiple rival communities under her authority. That alone would be impressive enough, but the way she ruled made her feel almost supernatural. She lived in a guarded palace, surrounded by thousands of female attendants, and communicated with the outside world through a single male intermediary. No husband, no public domestic role, just carefully controlled distance and sacred power. She sent diplomatic missions to China and was recognized there as a legitimate ruler, which shows she was not merely a local legend. When she died, records claim that more than 100 attendants were buried with her. Her tomb remains unconfirmed, and that unresolved mystery somehow fits perfectly. Himiko ruled like a myth while still alive. 28. Isabella I of Castile helped build Spain into a major imperial power, but she did it through a blend of brilliance, religious ferocity, and state violence that makes simple praise feel dangerously incomplete. Alongside Ferdinand of Aragon, she completed the Reconquista with the fall of Granada in 1492, ending Muslim rule in Iberia and reshaping the political identity of Spain. The same year, she backed Columbus's voyage, which opened the door to Spanish expansion across the Atlantic and changed world history in ways that were enormous, profitable, and catastrophic depending on who got conquered. But Isabella's reign also drove the Spanish Inquisition into terrifying prominence and enforced persecution against Jews, Muslims, and suspected heretics. Conversion was demanded, expulsion followed, and the machinery of religious uniformity ran on fear, torture, and fire. She was disciplined, devout, and absolutely convinced she was serving divine purpose. That conviction helped forge an empire, but it also helped justify cruelty on a massive scale. Power and piety made a dangerous combination in her hands. 29. Zenobia of Palmyra took one look at the Roman Empire, the giant military machine of the ancient world, and decided it seemed vulnerable enough to challenge. That level of confidence is either delusional or magnificent. In her case, for a while, it was magnificent. After her husband, a Roman client ruler, was assassinated, Zenobia seized power as regent for her young son and immediately started expanding rather than apologizing for existing. She conquered Egypt, pushed into Asia Minor, and built a breakaway empire that controlled much of Rome's eastern wealth, including a dangerously important grain supply. She even minted coins identifying herself with imperial authority, which is a very direct way of telling Rome the relationship has changed. Emperor Aurelian had to intervene personally to stop her, and even then it took major battles and a siege to finish the job. The expected ending was death or suicide in grand, tragic style. Instead, Zenobia reportedly lived on in Roman comfort. Most rebels get crushed. She got a villa. 30. Khutulun, the Mongol princess descended from Genghis Khan, built her marriage policy around a very simple test. If a man wanted her, he had to beat her in wrestling first. This turned out to be a terrible system for men and a fantastic business model for Khutulun. Every loser had to pay in horses, and since most challengers lost, she reportedly ended up with thousands of them and no husband for quite a while. Honestly, iconic. But she was not just a strong woman with a legendary dating filter. She was also active in warfare, riding into battle, and, according to later accounts, pulling enemy fighters from their horses in the middle of combat like they were inconvenient bags of grain. Even Marco Polo wrote about her, because obviously a warrior princess collecting horses from defeated suitors was too good a story to ignore. She eventually did marry, probably for politics, but on her own terms. That feels very on brand. She spent years turning romance into a contact sport and winning. 31. Hurrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana, entered the Ottoman world as an enslaved girl from Eastern Europe and ended up rewriting the rules of the imperial harem from the inside. Normally, an Ottoman concubine could rise only so far before tradition slammed the door. Hurrem basically removed the hinges. She became Suleiman the Magnificent's favorite, gained her freedom, had several children, and then achieved something almost unheard of. She married the Sultan legally. Ottoman rulers generally avoided formal marriage precisely to prevent this kind of concentrated influence. Suleiman did it anyway, which tells you how powerful her hold had become. She remained his central companion instead of being quietly replaced by the usual harem rotation, and her political influence reached into appointments, diplomacy, charitable foundations, and court alliances. She corresponded with foreign leaders, commissioned major public works, and helped shape imperial politics for years. When she died, Suleiman grieved deeply. Hurrem rose from slavery to become one of the most powerful women in the Ottoman world. That is not romance. That is a historical takeover. 32. Elizabeth I took a kingdom that was unstable, vulnerable, and not exactly Europe's main character, then ruled it for 45 years so effectively that England emerged as a major power by the time she was done. Her early life alone sounds like the setup to a paranoid thriller. Her mother was executed, she was declared illegitimate, and she spent years under suspicion in a court where survival often depended on saying less and understanding more. Once queen, she turned her unmarried status into a weapon, teasing marriage alliances without surrendering herself to any of them. Then came the Spanish Armada in 1588, a massive invasion threat from the most powerful Catholic monarchy in Europe. Elizabeth did not hide behind curtains and prayer. She appeared before troops at Tilbury and delivered the speech about having the heart and stomach of a king. The Armada failed, storms and English resistance wrecked it, and Elizabeth outlasted all her enemies. She died childless, but on her own terms, which was exactly how she preferred it. So now the argument starts. Which queen did we absolutely have to include but missed? And who on this list would you kick out first? No safe answers, name both, and defend it in the comments like your dynasty depends on it. For more weird, ruthless, unbelievable history, hit like, subscribe, and come back for the next round of historical chaos.